Well, welcome everyone. My name is Sadie Thayer. I'm the director of our museum, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is the last in our 2022 series. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. Before we get started, I would first like to acknowledge that November is Native American Heritage Month. And that as the Kittitas County Historical Museum, we are located on the historic homelands of the Kittitas and Pishwanapam peoples, who are now today part of the Yakama Nation, which is officially known as the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation, which was or is a federally recognized Native nation constituted under the treaty with the Yakamas of 1855. The indigenous stewards of this land practice a subsistence lifestyle through fishing, hunting, and gathering since time immemorial, and remain committed stewards of this land, cherishing it, protecting it, and using it as instructed by their elders.
You don't need to have
through generations, and actively practicing the traditions and culture as neighbors in the Ellensburg community. We also wish to thank and honor the Kittitas and Pishwanapam bands of indigenous peoples for sharing their stories and items with our museum by permitting us to be the cultural custodians of their collections. This has further given us opportunities to share their culture and traditions with visitors from across the world. We also acknowledge that as the Kittitas County Historical Museum, we represent all aspects and corners of present-day Kittitas County. History and heritage, and all the people who have lived here past and present. This includes all indigenous tribes and bands who have called these lands home since time immemorial. We recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. These include the Snoqualmie Indian tribe, the Piscoa or Wenatchee people, and the Moses Columbia people, who are both now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation and the Wanapum. So our lands are quite wide. I would also like to thank our membership for making tonight's presentation possible. Membership dues go to fund our evening lecture series, as well as care and support the collections and exhibits. So if you're a member, I especially want to thank you for making tonight's presentation possible. If you're not a member yet, please consider becoming one tonight and helping us to build our 2023 lecture series. After tonight's program, we will ask that you fill out a small survey so that we and our presenter can receive relevant feedback. It's important so that for us to have this information so we can review it and use the information to continue providing a great lecture series, especially when we're considering what we're going to do for next year. So that leads me to tonight's program. We have Carl Lilquist with us, and he is a geography professor at Central, whose teaching and research interests center on landforms and soils in the mountains and desert. He graduated from Central with undergraduate degrees in geography and geology. Later, he earned his Master of Science in Geography at Portland State University and a PhD in Geography at University of Utah. As a Central undergraduate, one of his first snowshoe hikes was a climb on Wenatchee Range's Earl Peak on an unwieldy pair of Yukons. Since then, he has snowshoed extensively in the Eastern Cascades, often with his wife Nancy and sons Eric and Jensen, but I'm sure he's going to tell you a lot more about that and his travels. So please join me in welcoming Carl.
Excellent.
Yes, thank you.
Using it here, not on the big screen.
I don't think I have Zoom on there. I tried. We should.
Oh, it's Zoom. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm going to just ask everyone who's on Zoom to mute. I do apologize, and then we'll have you unmute at the end of the presentation.
Sounds good. Okay, let me kind of get ready to go here. There we go. And we'll leave the lights on for a minute and then we're going to shut those down. It's a pleasure to present on this research. This is oddball stuff for me. I teach and I kind of am a geomorphologist. I study landforms and landscapes in mountains and deserts, and I also do soils in those same places. And this is more kind of historical, cultural geography, mix in some material science and things like that. It's just an odd thing for me to look at, but I got fascinated with it over time. With that, I want to direct you to the snowshoes that are near all the rows. I kind of cleaned out our basement tonight, and I brought snowshoes. And my question for you right off is, or my comment to you right off is, the snowshoes that you see here tonight were not always like that. These, what you have, and there's 40 years of snowshoe history right here, but snowshoes have changed a bunch. And so what I want to do is take you back to this and end. I had to put them in the back. And with, I'll bring it up with this. So this is the most high-tech snowshoe that we own. And we're going to start here. And how things have changed. And this is I don't know how old this design is, but it was still in use. I used some of these. I tried to use some of these climbing Earl Peak. And it was a really bad idea. Okay, so with that, let's get the ball rolling. Oh. So first off, I'm going to call these mountain snowshoes. Everything in here except for these here on this end, I'm going to call mountain snowshoes. Everything that's by you, I'll call mountain snowshoes. Our two key people tonight that I'm focusing this on, Bill Prater and Gene Prater, had slightly different names for them. Gene called them Western snowshoes, and his brother Bill called them Western mountain snowshoes. And later, Gene said the name Western didn't fit because these snowshoes weren't just used in the West, and they weren't just made in the West. They were they were made all over, and now they're made in China. So that doesn't work. So I'm just calling them mountain snowshoes. Okay, let me pause for a second. So Sadie, can you turn the light? Actually, how is this if we turn just the lights off in front? Is that better? Sure. This work like this? Yep. Okay, so with that, then what I want to do is try to help you understand or help you answer this question. How did Ellensburg's Prater family shape the changes in mountain snowshoes and snowshoeing from the late 40s to present? Okay, one simple question for us. And the one heads up for you, you're going to see a lot of black and white images, and these were, I'm going to put them in the backgrounds. These were taken by one of those two brothers, Gene Prater. So you'll see those a lot. I didn't take them, Gene took them. Really quickly about my background, I've mentioned, and Sadie said, Yukon snowshoes in the Wenatchee Range. That was my first snowshoe mountaineering trip. Those snowshoes should have stayed on top of my pack, or they should have been left on the route up. But instead, I tried to use them, and they were horrible to climb in. And I'll help you understand why. My buddy, who's now a really smart attorney, in Wenatchee had Sherpa snowshoes. He had Bill Prater snowshoes that looked like this, and he cruised right up Earl Peak. So that was the start. Since then, our family has snowshoed. My oldest son, Eric, and his buddy, Max Sentner, here, they're snowshoe mountaineering on top of Navajo Peak in the Wenatchee Range. Friends snowshoeing over time. This is up on Tronson Ridge. And then more recently, probably in the last 15 years or 20 years, I've woven snowshoes into two classes. So a snow class and a mountains class where we go out and snow camp. But before we do that, we have several trips where they get used to using snowshoes and traveling on snowshoes. And then finally, something that Brent's been involved in, doing snowshoe-based research where we're looking at snow issues and rock glacier issues in the Wenatchee Range. So kind of, I've used snowshoes in a variety of ways and a lot of different snowshoes as well. And I've been around people with different snowshoes. So the research that's the background of this tonight and of a paper that I wrote is based on interviews with the Prater family, with Fred Dunham, Tom Lyon, Fred Stanley, and Jack Powell. All these bottom four were all tied up here. They were doing stuff with the Praters. I had a couple research assistants long ago that helped in the field, family, friends, students, and then finally CW Brooks Library staff. So I've done a lot of digging to try to find this background. And this was a paper that came from it, just published in an obscure journal, but it looked at snowshoeing in North America, not focused on the Praters. So I've tweaked it tonight to meet that. Okay, so here we go. So if we start with traditional snowshoes, these originated 2,000 to 6,000 years ago in Eurasia, and they really didn't make it to North America until about 1,000 or somewhere in there, 1,000 years before present. Traditional snowshoes, and we can translate this to today, what you've got, have four main parts. They have a frame, the webbing or decking, we might call it, a hinge point, and then a binding. So everything we've got tonight, and most everything we've got in here tonight fits this. They won't look like this, but they have those parts. There were four traditional models that were around early on. And you've already seen the Yukon. I've mentioned that several times. Some of them 60 inches long. That's 5 feet. Beaver tails, which I've never worn. Bear paws I have worn. 20 inches wide. 20 inches wide. Now think about your hips and how your hips work on walking on something 20 inches wide. And then a long, narrow, pointed snowshoe called the Ojibwa. So keep in mind, 60 inches long, 20 wide, and then 6 pounds or more per pair. That's a lot on legs, a lot to carry. So hang on just a second. Okay, so I'm going to start us in the 1940s and 50s, and I'll do this for every decade or pairs of decades as we move toward present. Here's what happened during each of these time period, during this time period, and then I'll do this the same down the road. First of all, there were frame changes first in the 40s by a guy named Floyd Westover in the Adirondack Mountains. He modified thing. He modified a bear paw and made what was called the Westover modified bear paw. And what that did is narrowed it down, and it left a little stubby tail that when it dropped to the ground would slightly drag, and would help the snowshoe track. It would follow your foot, in other words. So that's one change. The owner of Tub Snowshoes, Harold Underwood, in the 50s, came up with the Green Mountain Bear Paw. This is a neat shoe. 36 inches long, 10 inches wide. So it's narrower than a bear paw, shorter than a Yukon, but now it's lightweight and it's more maneuverable. These are still beautiful snowshoes. And I've got one here that's close. To me, it's a little wide, but that is a Green Mountain Bear Paw. Okay. So that's far away. You folks want to know about the Praters, I bet. So let's now zoom into the Praters. This is an old shot of Gene on the left, Bill on the right, and in the middle, climbing legend Dave Mayer from Yakima, probably better known for his two skiing sons who were Olympians. They were all early members, founding members of what became known as the Sherpa Climbing Club. And the Sherpas weren't, if you kind of skim down through this, really weren't a formal organization. They were just a group of guys, guys early, but later, guys and gals that climbed. They wanted to climb, and it was a climbing club to get them out climbing. The problem was that the Praters and Dave Mayer, I think, were all farmers, and they didn't have time to climb in the summer. So if you don't have time to climb in the summer, but you're passionate about climbing, then you figure out how to snowshoe and climb in the winter. That's the roots of their desire to be out in the snow. And so, but they were faced with trying to climb in these. So Bill is standing here on the left, and he's showing how he's trying to go up a steep slope, and he's doing it, but you often almost had to pull yourself up with ski poles, or better yet, ice axes on these snowshoes that had very little traction. And you didn't go straight up slopes, you traversed up slopes. And so the problem really was that they're trying to do snowshoe mountaineering with lowland snowshoes. And they were, as I understand it, they didn't have a lot of money. And this is right after World War II, and there's lots of these in military surplus stores. So that then gets these guys thinking, how do you make something that would work better? So they started off doing frame modifications, and they've been described as clever. In the interviews that I did, people said both these guys were clever. They were tinkers. They liked to tinker on things and get them to work better. And in doing that, combine that with the fact that you could get these snowshoes really cheap if you wheeled and dealed and you went to Stan's Mary Mart in Wenatchee, like Yvonne told me about doing, and she bought 20 pairs of broken Yukon snowshoes for $1 a piece. And she hauled them back to Ellensburg, and Gene and Bill started working their magic on them. And it may not look like magic. They cut the tails off. So now you have a snowshoe, instead of being 5 feet long, now maybe it's 4 feet. So you chop that tail off. And then you go a step further and you pull out Yvonne, and I should back up because she's an important part of the story. Yvonne was married to Gene, And you may have seen her book. She's written a neat book on Snoqualmie Pass and what's the Gorp Clop and something. It's a mountain camping type cooking book. But Yvonne was also, being a farm wife, she was a canner. She had a big canning kettle. Gene reportedly stuck the tails of these snowshoes in that canner and either boiled them or flipped them over and steamed them and then bent the tails. So now you've got a Green Mountain bear paw shaped snowshoe. You've knocked that tail off and then go a step further and go, you know what, let's chop that long toe off and instead replace it with a short, steep aluminum toe. All this led them to a snowshoe that was more functional. So those were frame modifications. Then go a step further and recognize that these snowshoes until then had essentially a rawhide toe cord right here. And think about the Cascades snow, this Cascade concrete, this wet snow that we often get. And think about snowshoeing on these for a day and what that does to rawhide. Even if you seal it with urethane, over time, that rawhide will loosen up and it'll get soggy, and as do the other leather straps. And so they became known as wet noodle bindings. And so now, if you're Bill or Gene, you take a thin shaft of steel, like the size of a big nail in diameter, and weld onto it 2 chain links, one on each end. And now you have a hinge on which to attach a binding. So what you've done is created a smooth hinge action, and you've made that snowshoe now follow your foot better. And that's important, that when you lift your foot, you want the snowshoe to go with it. And these guys they were climbing in tough conditions, and they wanted that positive relationship there between foot and snowshoe. And then third, I mentioned to you, trying to climb on Yukons was horrible because I was sliding backwards on Earl Peak. They solved that by, first they tried wrapping rope around frames. They tried putting nails or screws into the frames and having them stick out. But the best solution was taking aluminum angle, screwing it on here, maybe serrating the edges like here, and then you've got traction. Finally, by chopping those toes off or by shifting the hinge point forward, and here you can you see that gap where there's a hole where there's nothing? That was the old hinge point. And Gene or Bill shifted this forward to try to get that toe out there where you could dig in better and you could climb better. So those were things that they did in the 50s to really shape snowshoes. At the same time, they were both really literate guys, and Gene was a writer. He published the first articles that I had seen by him, and maybe the first articles on, not the first articles, but the first articles on maybe Western snowshoeing were written by Gene. So they were changing the nature of snowshoes, and now they were trying to kind of extol the virtues of them. So now we hit the 60s, and there's a lot going on. There's, back on the East Coast, there's the use of neoprene coated nylon now instead of rawhide. Neoprene coated nylon had been around a long time, since like the 30s, but it finally made its way to snowshoes. it's waterproof, it's strong, it's cut resistant. That's beautiful compared to rawhide. It's really all the things that rawhide's not, especially in wet snow. Secondly, tubular aluminum snowshoe frames did not originate here. They originated in California, from what I can tell. So these beautiful frames, and I should send these back. These are neat. These were Black Forest snowshoes made by a couple right out of their garage in California, in the Sierra Nevada. And there's no bindings on them. That's the way I got them there. So I don't have bindings for them, but now you've replaced wood that was generally weaker and it was heavier. And notice how high the toes are on those. Those toes really bend up, and you can see it here too. They made snowshoes that would work in deep, soft snow. But they didn't know marketing. And they're a little bit funky too. Look how they've used parachute cord as the decking. It looks like parachute cord. So what were the Praters doing at this time? Well, they're tinkering and testing. And their idea of that, they're doing that with the aluminum frames and with neoprene coated nylon. And their idea of tinkering and testing involved them kind of creating a prototype, and then they and their Sherpa buddies would go out and test them. They'd go hike on them. Snowshoe on, and then they'd come back and they'd modify. One of the Sherpas, and I remember him telling me this, and I was cracking up. A guy named Tom Lyon. Tom he didn't buy into this whole snowshoe thing quite as much as the other guys. He was a skier at heart, and Tom said, "Gee, Gene and Bill, if you keep working on it, you're going to create a ski." It's like, you keep doing this long enough, the solution is the ski. But they loved snowshoes, and they saw the beauty of them in the maneuverability on steep terrain, brushy terrain, etc. The other thing they're doing at that time is they're doing these trips, this winter mountaineering, and they're snowmobiling in, which I need to talk with Nancy about getting a snowmobile now. I'm inspired by this. But they would snowmobile in and then climb from there. And so this opened up country that we can't use. We snowshoers can't readily use unless you go in and snow camp, working your way into a place like the Teanaway or the Upper Cleveland, place like that. And you can see on the front end here, they've got strapped on, there's 2 pairs of snowshoes, and there's a shovel over the top of that. They'd pull guys with these. They would, somehow they'd get a crew of guys in there to snowshoe. This also is a time when Gene came out with the first, as far as I know, the first snow hiking, or the first snowshoe or cross-country ski guide for places. And this is like 1969. Some of you may have this or a newer edition of this. The old edition, I just love. It's got great trips in it. And it was a guidebook. This was revolutionary in the sense that there's now a guidebook for the Cascades and the Olympics to snowshoe. Here's a bunch of those guys. I was hoping, I don't see any old Sherpas here tonight, but if you know, this was Gene, this is Bill. If any of you know Jack Powell, that's fresh-faced Jack Powell. Here's Fred Stanley, here's Fred Dunham, and I don't know the rest of those guys. But that was, they were members of this club. Okay, Gene Prater, the other thing he would do, and I was subject to this later, but beginning in the 60s, he would say, come work on my farm. Or if somebody said, hey, I want a pair of these snowshoes. And he would go, hey, no problem, come work on my farm. You could buck hay, split wood, pick rocks, and you can earn a pair of snowshoe frames or a pair of bindings or maybe a whole pair of snowshoes, depending on how much you work. When I met him in the 80s, that deal was still on. And I nearly got my first pair of snowshoes that way. I ended up coming up with the cash, but I could have paid for it like that. So the Prater barter system. Okay, so now things liven up even more in the 70s, and there's a lot of action out here. And we're going to focus on that. In the 1970s, by then, Bill and Gene had parted ways. They were no longer partnering on the farm out west of town. Bill had gone to take engineering classes. He'd had a job doing some kind of engineering stuff, and then he was laid off during kind of a Boeing crash in the late 60s. And so he and Barb formed Sherpa Design. And their first steps were essentially creating, a hinged traction device. So now you have a hinge device on the bottom of your foot that's attached, that's really the binding, but it has a traction device tied to it. And so here's examples of those. And these are my versions of them. They're modified some, but these had essentially a couple neat characteristics with them. They gave you a good traction with those original bindings. That's the story. And there were two types of bindings. That's where I was going. There's two types of bindings. There's the kind of the gentle bindings that I'm passing around. And then if you can see, these are aggressive as heck. And they came up with that essentially after going back east and climbing in the Adirondacks in winter. So that was called the Tucker claw. So claws on the bottoms of snowshoes. Sherpa was selling these, either they were selling them as Sherpa or they were partnering with the snowshoe company Tubs to sell these as Sherpa Tubs. And in fact, if you look on those snowshoes, they may say Sherpa Tubs on them. Here was Bill's little catalog, and here's those bindings that I was talking about. And actually, this is pre-hinged claw. This is just a little traction kit that you could attach to your wood snowshoes. Then they did ice axe baskets. Some of you may have seen those. But the one I've never seen, look at these little kid snowshoes that were made out of wire, it looks like. And so that was Sherpa at the start. They weren't selling snowshoes yet. They were selling parts, and except for these little tiny kid shoes. Bill had this patented. He had the hinge rod binding patented in the 70s. That's the only patent that I know of that the Praters had. And then came the snowshoes. So I think it was 72 when these first came out. The old ones are the yellow ones. That's what I've got. Later, they were anodized like this. And these were really a beautiful little shoe. And you see them on Craigslist, you see them on Facebook. They're still around. They're cheap and they work okay. The little guys especially are a neat small shoe. The third thing about them is, beside the hinged rod, the aluminum frame, they had synthetic decking. And what this did is for the first time, you eliminated a whole lot of labor-intensive lacing. Everything I've mentioned to you so far, including those first aluminum shoes that I sent around, were laced entirely, and that's a lot of work. They replaced it with decking, neoprene coated decking. It saved labor, and when you lifted your foot, it dumped that heavy snow that so characterizes the Cascades. Bill was writing stuff now too, not as prolifically as Gene, but he published this little snowshoers equipment guide that helped kind of walk novices through what to do. And think about it for a moment. Think about traditionalists, especially on the East Coast, where there seems to be kind of more people steeped in tradition. They were hard to convince that an aluminum shoe with synthetic decking and synthetic lacing was a snowshoe. It just didn't look like that. And so Bill and Barb were fighting that in their attempts to build Sherpa. This was a tough thing to overcome. Despite all that, in retrospective, Outside Magazine named the Sherpa snowshoe the 1972 most influential gear of all time. This is an important thing when you think about all the changes in recreational gear that we've seen over our lifetimes, from mountain bikes to skis to snowshoes. These are really thought of highly. And again, I would wear them today. They're not as good as some of this stuff today, but they work. The downside for Bill and Barb is they didn't have a lot of cash cushion, and they hit the warm, dry winter and the snow drought of 76, 77. That was an El Nino year. There was hardly any snow, even at Snoqualmie Pass. REI canceled their orders because they were selling through REI until then. And they essentially had to sell. So they got out of the business, and Bill kept tinkering over the years, but was never back as a major player after this. At about the same time, his brother Gene really starts ramping it up. And I think these guys were competitive. I don't know if they were trying to one up each other or what, but they competed, and Gene forms Prater Snowshoes. And Prater initially took on the Westover modified bear pod design. Remember that little tail here at the end? That's here. And I think they were easier. It was an easier bend to make. When I was a college student, I went out to Gene's house, and he showed a group of us his bender, and it was just a homemade, made from old farm pulleys where you pulled the aluminum around and bent it. And this was an easier bend to make than if you rounded this into a Green Mountain bear pod. Gene had some subtle differences from Sherpas, or I should say Prater snowshoes were subtly different from Sherpas. They had a higher toe. And instead of that hinge rod flexing binding, their binding was fixed. It was mounted on the bottom of these. And these are neat shoes. I'll shoot around these too for you. Let's see if you and be careful, two of them have sharp claws on the bottom. So these are Prater shoes that you see, and you're seeing them a little bit later in life. I've relaced them and done some things with them. Those little shoes that Ruth Ann's holding there, those are beautiful shoes. They're great shoes. They're light. The Praters made neat shoes, and Prater Snowshoes, Gene's business, made good stuff. Gene did this, they did this in a little old house on their property. So they owned a house, and then there was like the older house that sat there, if I understand things right. This is a Seattle Times article where Gene is on the sewing machine, sewing some of that decking, and his daughter Connie is pounding rivets here. So it was a family affair. They sold them, they advertised in magazines like Summit Magazine. They also, and if you contacted him, he would send you a free brochure that looked like this. And what you're seeing, what's being passed around, I think is one, it's two of these smaller ones. And then the big pair is called the Ellensburg model. That's the pair of mine. So he was trying to go that way, but he never went as big a time as Sherpa. And I think partly that was, I think a lot of that was that he was farming full time and he didn't want this to just eat up his life. He could have gone bigger, but he chose to keep it smaller. And he and his hired people that his hired farmers, he would keep on in the winter and they would build snowshoes together. So not a huge operation. He was also writing, you may have seen one of his snowshoe books that's just about snowshoeing, not where to snowshoe, but how to do it. And I was looking online yesterday, there's at least 5 editions of this now. Pretty cool. So snowshoe how to. Okay, so now we hit the 80s and things with the Praters, Gene just keeps kind of chugging along. Bill's mostly out of the snowshoe creation business, although I think he was kind of on retainer with Sherpa to advise on minor changes. But the big changes are happening elsewhere. And I wanted to just show you 2. In California, a guy named Bob Wallace made some aluminum snowshoes and they're sitting on the floor back there. And I gotta just show you these for a minute because they are a riot. They're really neat, but they're problematic. And so these, and Nancy, have you worn a pair of these? So Nancy's worn a pair and I've worn mine once too. But, and I've talked to Bob and Bob sent us stuff. And he's an old guy. He may be dead by now, but he designed a snowshoe that it's all aluminum and it's aggressive as hell. Can you see that? These have the best traction of any snowshoe I've ever worn. And then you throw in this crampon and I mean, these are dynamite on icy steep slopes. Beautiful. But there's at least 2 problems. One, when you walk on hard snow with these, it was either Gene or Bill who told me it was like walking on garbage can lids. They're loud. They are loud. I remember walking along the freeway and they almost drowned out the sound of cars near Mount Margaret. The second thing is with that sharp edge, what's it do to your pants or your gaiters? I've shredded a pair of gaiters wearing these as well. But they were neat. I mean, the concept is cool. It's just there were some problems with them. They didn't solve, and maybe no one ever solves all the issues with these. Okay, so that was one. In Colorado, red feather snowshoes came out. Some of you may know of or own red feathers. These are different because they have a flexible hinge. They don't have a solid hinge rod. They have a flexible hinge that when you step off of it, it flips back up. And in doing that, these are great for runners. These were designed for people who ran on snowshoes. So a flexible hinge, and secondly, they had traction in the rear. So now we're heading toward snowshoes that have more traction because with the Praters, all you had with the Praters and the Sherpas was traction up front. So how do you get more control? That's the question. And for those of you who have snowshoed, that's a problem when you step on this on a side slope and your ball of your foot's in, but the rear of your foot wants to slide. This is an attempt to solve that. Gene's still chugging along. He's reviewing snowshoes in Summit magazine, for example, and he's offering snowshoe classes. And when I was an undergraduate here, I took one of those classes. Maybe some of you have done the same thing. They were inexpensive. They were awesome. He helped you get confidence. You build a igloo on them. They were awesome deals. And I think we went out like 3 times snowshoeing. So now, kind of as we near the end of this, from the 90s into the 2000s, still more changes. And first off, Gene dies suddenly with a heart issue. So he died by 1993. And Bill is still consulting, he's still tinkering. And one of the things he kept messing around with was a binding that was like a ski boot binding where you locked in, essentially, trying to make a more solid connection between boot and ski. He died in 2010. But what's happened kind of since the passing of Bill and Gene in the world of snowshoes is that Tubbs followed up with a better binding, and really inspired by what Bill was trying to do. Again, this looks more kind of like a bicycle toe clip, and then with a way to really crank down the heel here. And on some of these snowshoes, this pair of Nancy's now is really a take on that, where essentially you can ratchet this tighter on your heel. I don't know how well these last, we'll see, but that kind of change, I think, can be traced back to Bill. More live hinge, Atlas snowshoes, if you own a pair of those or buy a pair of those, they have that live hinge, and they respond a little differently. Good snowshoes. And with Atlas, they also added rear traction as well. So some changes. The live hinge part isn't a Prater thing, but the recognition of more traction really was. And then what I think are the best snowshoes around started with a guy named Bill Forrest, who created the first pair of MSR snowshoes, and he made them. What do you think this is? What was that? It's a snowshoe, but what was this? It was a blue plastic barrel. And he took that and put traction on the sides and added a binding that somehow was attached in there. And he knew that this was a way to further lower labor. You can make them cheaper, they're light, and they're strong. And so there's a couple of those floating around in here tonight, these early, I would call them Denali's or Evos. And then you go a step further and you add a heavy piece of wire that you can flip up with your ski pole. And now you've got a heel lift. So, you can go straight up slopes. And then go a step further and you can add tails to these that will lengthen them in different snow types, or if a different person wants to wear them. I don't totally buy the tails idea because it changes your balance point on that hinging point. But the concepts are interesting, and I absolutely use the heel lifts. Then you go one step further, and there's one pair of these in here. These are a steel band with a serrated edge like those polar paws, but the serrated edge doesn't tear your pants up, which is nice. But they're aggressive. You've got a good claw underneath. These are called the MSR lightnings. Aggressive traction, they're light, and what you find is they give you control, especially side hill and downhill. So essentially that's a summary of kind of where we've been since the late 1940s. And if you think about it, what's happened to snowshoes is they've got smaller, lighter. They're now made out of all synthetic material. The hinge points have moved forward, and they've got sturdy bindings, and they've got aggressive traction. That's, to me, that's the change, those 6 changes. And what that gives you is maneuverability with a snowshoe that follows your foot. You've got control, uphill, downhill, side hill, and you've got lower maintenance. And I would argue the Praters were instrumental in all of that. Every step here, what they did as farmer, climber, tinkerers took us there. And it's kind of neat to read this. Gene wrote this in 1974. Someone else might have said the same thing in 1950. Someone else may say it now because these keep evolving. And I don't think I've got the latest and greatest here tonight, but the point is these have evolved and they were a key part of that, which is cool, right here in Ellensburg, with much of this learning taking place. So with that, thank you. Thanks for listening and participating, and thanks for supporting the museum tonight. I'll field any questions you've got. Yeah.
So did Gene and that guy Westover from the Adirondacks, did they know each other?
No,
They never
I don't
knew
think
each
so. He knew a lot of the Eastern snowshoers. He would go back and offer, like the Appalachian Mountain Club would bring him back to teach winter survival and snowshoeing. But I don't know that he knew Westover. Westover was older, and he did his thing in the 40s. I know Gene knew the Tubbs guys, Underwood and later successors with Tubbs, but I don't know that he knew Westover. I'm guessing on that. I knew Gene slightly. I knew Bill better, but my bet is Gene didn't know Westover. But there was sharing between regions. People would there was another snowshoe book out. I forget the authors, Osgood and something, that may have shown those snowshoes. And so that could have inspired Bill and Gene on their thinking. Yeah. Yeah.
Why do you think that most of the developments seem to be Western focused? Is that just the number of mountains we have versus the East, or the paradigm shifts, or a combination?
Yeah, it's a good question. They talk about it a lot, that the Eastern folks were harder to convince to change. But yeah, just more mountains out west. The Eastern conditions could be really harsh, icy summits. But I think tradition and just sheer number of mountains, and maybe sheer number of outdoor oriented folks too, might have been pushing that as well. And it seemed in the West, it seemed to be centered in Colorado. There were, at least, I didn't mention one of them tonight, but there were a couple Colorado folks. There were a couple in California, and then the Praters in Washington. Can't think of any others, but those were kind of the main players. Yeah. good question. Yeah, Karen?
So did snowshoe development follow a similar pattern in the Scandinavian countries? What's going on?
Yeah, good question. What's happened there? I followed that a bit back when I was writing that paper, but I didn't get the sense that snowshoeing was as big in Europe as it had become here. You can certainly find snowshoers and snowshoes there, but I didn't get the sense it was as big. I've seen photos of some. I know there's European snowshoe makers, but beyond that, I don't know, Karen.
Maybe
Yeah.
more skiing or skiing.
Yeah, I had a little bit of tunnel vision. I kind of felt like North America was enough to bite off when I did this, but I know they were doing it, maybe not as much. Anything else? Yeah, here.
I'm just curious about what search and rescue uses. Do they use the snowshoes in the winter rescues?
I would assume they do. Glenn, do you or Brent? No, I don't know. I'm assuming they do.
I know search and rescue people,
With, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Eric, was there a
I was
question?
just wondering that you were talking about the MSRs out of Colorado. I think
Yeah.
that are probably the best in your opinion. But what would be price range?
New or used?
Either.
I can't tell Nancy this because I think I'm on a snowshoe moratorium. But, if you wanted to get these sweet little Denali's, I think these are Denali's. They don't have the heel lip, but if you shop around used, you can find them for $30 to $50 a pair used. And they're a great shoe.
They're noisy though.
They are noisy, yeah. They're not as noisy as the aluminum, but they are noisy. I agree. These hold their value better, these lightnings, and these new are over 200, maybe 250 or so now, and used 100, 150 maybe. The quieter, these are to me are a better shoe.
I'll probably never use them again, but I did one time when we were up in Iron Creek, for Blue Pass.
Yeah.
And I traded off with a friend of mine, I don't remember his name anymore. I went in with cross country skis and came out with snowshoes. And they were the wide ones. They had that.
Yeah.
Wider.
Horrible. Yeah. Yeah, these are, so when you look at them, I mean, it's almost like walking normally with them. I like that, or I think those are as wide. I've bent a pair of these and MSR stood behind them. I worn out one of these claws and I just sent it in this year. So this got new claws and I forget what they charged, but it wasn't. MSR is good. They make a good product, but they're also in Seattle and they fix them there, which is nice. So there are a lot of these like Atlas and Tubbs. I think you got to pay to have them check them out. It's a hassle.
Yeah.
MSR, it's an easy deal.
So
So
are probably likely to be the best.
to me, it's a good shoe. Yeah. Anything else tonight?
Costco sells a decent pair of snowshoes.
Really?
Actually, yeah, for $30-some or,
Holy cow.
So I think they're more like 75
I
now.
don't know.
Are they bundled it like in a shrink wrap pack of 6?
And sometimes they have adjustable poles as part of the package.
Oh, yeah, gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. Yeah.
You know, I kind of poo-poo those because, we got all these other great snowshoes, but I do a lot of snowshoeing with the Cascadians, and there are some Cascadians that swear by those Costco ones.
Yeah.
And I think I was at Costco and they were like $79 for the snowshoes and poles.
Yeah.
Bargain.
There you go.
I don't know if I trusted on a steep side here.
Any other questions tonight? Hey, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Hey, you guys have a good night. And I'll be around.